I never imagined that the happiest years of my life would quietly turn into the darkest chapter one had ever lived through. For almost 8 years, I believed my marriage was a kind of love story people spent their lives searching for. My wife, Laura, had been my best friend long before she became my partner. We met in college during a rainy autumn afternoon when the campus library was nearly empty. I still remember the way she laughed when I spilled coffee on my notebook while trying to impress her with some stupid joke. That laugh became the sound that anchored my life for years. It was warm, genuine, and impossible to forget. Back then, everything about our relationship felt effortless. Laura had this energy that filled every room she entered. She was ambitious, funny, and incredibly compassionate. She volunteered at animal shelters, remembered every birthday in our friend group, and somehow managed to make even the most boring days feel exciting. I was the opposite in many ways. I was quieter, more analytical, the kind of person who preferred structure and routine. Somehow, those differences made us work perfectly together. After college, we moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't glamorous by any means. The walls were thin. The kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time, and the heating system made strange, rattling noises during winter nights. But it was ours. Every evening we cooked together, played music while washing dishes, and talked about the future, as if it were something we could build piece by piece with our own hands. Laura dreamed big. She wanted a successful career in marketing, her own team someday, and the kind of life where she could travel the world while building something meaningful. I admired that about her. Her ambition pushed both of us forward. While she worked late nights developing campaigns and chasing promotions, I focused on growing my own career in software development. We supported each other through every challenge, celebrating small victories like promotions or even just surviving stressful weeks at work. 3 years after we started dating, I proposed. It happened during a weekend trip to the mountains. The air was cold and fresh, the kind that made every breath feel clean and sharp. We were standing near a small lake surrounded by tall pine trees when I pulled the ring out of my jacket pocket. I was nervous in a way I had never felt before. My hands were shaking slightly as I knelt down. Laura's eyes widened with surprise before filling with tears. She didn't even let me finish the proposal before saying yes. That moment felt like the beginning of everything. Our wedding the following year was simple but beautiful. Friends and family gathered in a garden venue filled with soft lights and flowers. Laura walked down the aisle wearing a dress that seemed to glow in the evening sunlight. When she reached me, she squeezed my hand so tightly that I felt a strange mix of excitement and calm. It was a moment I believed I had found the person who would stand beside me through every storm life could throw at us. For a long time, it felt like that promise was real. The first few years of marriage were peaceful. We eventually upgraded from the tiny apartment to a modest suburban house with a small backyard. Laura decorated every corner with plants and warm lighting, turning the house into something that felt alive. Weekend mornings were our favorite time together. We would sit on the back patio drinking coffee while the neighborhood slowly woke up around us. Looking back now, those mornings feel like scenes from someone else's life, because somewhere along the way, things began to change. At first, the shifts were small, so small that I barely noticed them. Laura started working longer hours. Her company had grown rapidly, and she had been promoted to a managerial role, overseeing several marketing campaigns. She seemed proud of the responsibility, and I supported her completely. Late nights at the office became common, especially during big projects. Sometimes she wouldn't come home until after 10. "Sorry," she would say while dropping her bag near the door. "Deadlines are killing me." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Success had always been important to her, and I admired that drive. But the late nights slowly became something else. Phone calls she took in another room. Text messages she quickly dismissed when I walked by. Weekend meetings that appeared suddenly on her calendar. At first, I ignored the uneasy feeling growing in the back of my mind. Relationships required trust, and I refused to become the kind of husband who questioned everything. Laura had never given me a reason to doubt her before. Yet the distance between us kept expanding. The laughter we once shared during dinner became shorter, more distracted. She often seemed mentally somewhere else, scrolling through her phone or replying to messages while I talked about my day. Sometimes she looked at me with a polite smile, but it felt different from the warmth I used to see in her eyes. Months passed like this. Then one evening something happened that planted the first real seed of suspicion. It was a Thursday night in early spring. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I worked on my laptop in the living room. Laura had told me she would be home late again because of an important client presentation. Around 9, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally I would have ignored it, but the message preview lit up the screen before it faded, and the name attached to it wasn't one I recognized. Mark. The message was short. Miss you already. I stared at the phone for several seconds, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a co-worker joking around. Maybe I misunderstood the context. Maybe it was completely harmless. But a strange tension formed in my chest. For the first time in years, doubt crept into my thoughts. When Laura finally came home that night, she looked exhausted but oddly cheerful. She kissed me on the cheek, grabbed a glass of water, and sat beside me on the couch. "How was your day?" she asked casually. I studied her face, searching for something unfamiliar. "Busy," I replied. I almost mentioned the message. Almost. But something stopped me. Instead, I said nothing. That silence would become the beginning of everything that followed. Because over the next few weeks, the small details kept piling up. Laura guarded her phone more carefully than ever before. She changed her password, something she had never done during our entire marriage. When I walked into a room unexpectedly, she sometimes locked the screen quickly. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed again on the bedside table. My heart pounded as I stared at it. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew crossing that boundary would change something between us forever. But curiosity and fear can be stronger than morality in moments like that. Slowly, I picked up the phone. The notification appeared again. Mark. And this time the message said something that made my stomach drop. Last night was perfect. In that moment, the world I believed in began to crack. The quiet house suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I was standing in someone else's life. And deep down, a terrifying thought formed in my mind. My wife might be cheating on me, but I still didn't know the truth. Not yet. And when I finally discovered it, everything would explode in a way none of us could ever undo. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Laura's smiling face and the glowing warmth I used to feel, overlaid with the image of her texting someone named Mark. I tried convincing myself that it could be nothing, maybe a co-worker, maybe a harmless friendship, but the words "last night was perfect" echoed in my mind relentlessly. I had spent years trusting her implicitly, but now I felt like a stranger in my own home. The betrayal wasn't confirmed, but the seed of doubt had taken root, and I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I went through my routine mechanically. Breakfast felt tasteless. The aroma of fresh coffee, usually comforting, made me anxious instead. I watched Laura from across the kitchen as she packed her bag for work, her cheerful banter with me now sounding hollow. The very sound of her voice seemed like a test I was failing. I couldn't bring myself to ask about Mark, not yet, but I needed answers. My mind churned with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Over the following days, I became a silent observer in my own life. I started noticing small patterns I had overlooked before. The way Laura always made sure her phone was in her hand, how she seemed to brighten unusually when receiving notifications, or the secretive smile she would flash after a late-night call. I tracked her schedule meticulously, noting the gaps in her stories and the sudden late work nights that never quite added up. The woman I had once admired as honest and loving was becoming an enigma, and each piece of evidence I gathered only deepened my unease. One Friday evening, after she had gone to a client dinner, I decided to investigate further. I couldn't risk confronting her blindly. I needed proof. Using a combination of subtle observation and digital breadcrumbs, I began piecing together her interactions. I didn't want to invade her privacy in a reckless way. But at this point, my trust had been eroded to the point where I had to know. Every late-night message, every secretive glance, every unexplained weekend outing had to be accounted for. It was late Saturday night when I finally had a breakthrough. Laura had said she was meeting friends at a quiet cafe downtown, but I followed her, keeping my distance. The streets were slick from a recent rain, reflecting the neon lights of the city in puddles that rippled with every passing car. The scent of wet asphalt mixed with roasted coffee beans from the nearby cafes, creating an oddly intimate yet unsettling atmosphere. I watched as Laura entered the cafe, and moments later, a man appeared from the shadows to greet her, Mark. He was tall, with a confident air that immediately made my skin crawl. The way Laura leaned into him, laughing softly, exchanging words that I couldn't hear from my vantage point. It was all too familiar. My heart raced as the confirmation sank in. She was cheating. The years of trust, love, and shared dreams felt like fragile glass shattering beneath my feet. I didn't confront her that night. I simply observed, letting the scene imprint on my mind. Every laugh, every touch, every shared secret between them became a mental photograph I couldn't erase. When they left the cafe together, walking side by side, I knew I had enough to plan what had come next. But the anger wasn't immediate. It was slow, simmering, like a fire waiting to ignite. I realized that if I wanted to expose her properly, it had to be meticulous. Hasty reactions would only give her the upper hand. Over the next few weeks, I dug deeper. I traced phone records, watched patterns of activity, and documented every late-night message and suspicious behavior. The process was exhausting mentally and emotionally. Every day, I had to play the part of a normal husband, keeping the mask of obliviousness while inside, rage and heartbreak battled for control. My home, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield of silent resentment. Even the familiar smell of her perfume, once comforting, now triggered flashes of betrayal. I also began replaying our past together, questioning every memory, every hug, every whispered, "I love you." Every shared dream suddenly felt tainted by doubt. How could I have missed the subtle signs? The minor lies she had told over the years suddenly appeared in stark relief, weaving together a narrative I didn't want to accept. It wasn't just about the act of cheating. It was a deception, the manipulation, and the way she concealed a whole side of herself from me. Then came the day that finally gave me the leverage I needed. While Laura was at work, I accessed one of her email accounts she had carelessly left logged on our home computer. Among a jumble of newsletters and work notifications, I found private correspondence between her and Mark. Photos, intimate messages, and details of their meetings were laid bare. I felt sick, furious, and strangely empowered all at once. The evidence was undeniable, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a grim sense of control over a situation that had made me feel powerless for so long. But control came with its own cost. I had to strategize carefully. Exposing her wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my life, and ensuring she faced the consequences of her betrayal in a way she couldn't ignore. I couldn't let my emotions dictate the outcome. This required patience, precision, and an understanding of human psychology. Every move had to be calculated. Every interaction had to be timed perfectly. I started with the digital trail. I compiled every text, every message, every photo into a single document. I even traced the locations of their secret meetups. My living room, which had once been a cozy space for Netflix nights and board games, became a war room of sorts. Maps, screenshots, and notes were spread across the table. The once comforting smell of coffee now mingled with my rising tension as I planned my next steps. It was methodical, cold, and deliberate, but it had to be. The stakes were too high for anything less. Meanwhile, I maintained a facade of normalcy around Laura. I greeted her with a smile, asked about her day, and shared trivial stories about work. She never suspected a thing. Every glance she gave me, every casual touch, was a reminder how easily people can hide their true selves. The betrayal didn't just hurt. It revealed a truth I had never fully comprehended. Intimacy is fragile, trust is sacred, and once broken, it leaves a wound that seeps into every aspect of life. Finally, the moment to act came. I chose a gathering, a casual dinner party with friends who were close to both of us. The kind of event where secrets are hard to hide and reputations are easily tarnished. I had everything prepared. Screenshots, messages, photos, and even a detailed timeline of their encounters. The goal wasn't to humiliate for the sake of cruelty. It was to reveal the truth that had been deliberately hidden from me for months. It was justice, carefully disguised as revelation. As the night approached, my hands shook with anticipation and fear. The familiar smells of roasted garlic and wine from the restaurant mingled with the tension that clung to me like a second skin. Every laugh in the crowd felt amplified. Every glance from Laura felt like a challenge. I had rehearsed my approach, thought through every possible reaction, and anticipated her attempts to deny or deflect. The stage was set, and the players were oblivious to the script that had been written for them. That night, the culmination of months of secrecy, heartbreak, and meticulous planning would finally unfold. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The evening of the dinner party arrived, and every step I took toward the venue felt heavier than the last. The restaurant had been carefully chosen, cozy but public, familiar yet intimate enough that whispers would carry. Warm light spilled from the chandeliers, reflecting off polished wooden tables, and the faint scent of rosemary and grilled meats filled the air. The murmurs of laughter and clinking glasses around me contrasted sharply with the storm of thoughts inside my head. I felt like a man walking on a tightrope over a bottomless pit, every step a careful calculation between vengeance and exposure. Laura arrived fashionably late, radiant as always, her hair catching the soft lighting and cascading over her shoulders. She smiled at friends, her laugh rolling through the room like it always had, oblivious to the weight of the secret she carried. I watched her for a long moment, my chest tight, recalling the mornings we had spent in this very neighborhood, sipping coffee in the sun-drenched corners of our old apartment. How distant those memories felt now, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. I had prepared my evidence meticulously. Screenshots, messages, and photos were organized in a digital folder on my tablet. A printed timeline mapped out every interaction between Laura and Mark. Secret meetings, texts, stolen evenings, and lies that had been told with such ease that I believed them without hesitation. I had rehearsed the order of exposure, my voice carefully measured, my demeanor calm. The goal was not cruelty. It was truth, justice, and reclaiming my life from the deceit that had poisoned it. Dinner began like any other gathering. Friends greeted each other. Stories were exchanged, and the soft hum of conversation filled the room. Laura sat across from me, radiant, chatting animatedly with a mutual friend about a recent work event. Every word she spoke, every gesture, seemed designed to remind me of how effortlessly she could mask her actions. My hands were clammy, my stomach tight, but I knew there was no turning back. The moment had come. I cleared my throat. A sudden hush fell over the table as my friends noticed the serious tone in my voice. Laura's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing her face. I opened the tablet, displaying the first screenshot. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light, and the room seemed to contract, focusing everyone's attention entirely on me. These messages, I began, my voice steady despite the storm of emotion inside me, are from my wife Laura to a man named Mark. I swiped through text after text, each one more incriminating than the last. They began months ago. Late-night meetings, secret trips, lies told to cover their tracks. Every one of these is verifiable. I have the evidence. Gasps echoed around the table. Chairs shifted. Friends leaned forward, and all eyes turned to Laura. Her face went pale, a sharp contrast to the vibrant woman who had just minutes ago been laughing across from me. Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief and panic. For the first time in years, she was speechless. What is this?" she stammered, her voice trembling as she attempted to reach for the tablet. But I held it just out of reach. "Laura," I said firmly, my voice carrying the weight of months of betrayal and sleepless nights, "this is the truth you chose to hide. Not just from me, but from everyone who trusted you. Every lie, every stolen night, every text you thought I would never see, it ends tonight." Mark's name began to surface in whispers among the friends, some recognizing the man from social media, some connecting dots from casual mentions Laura had made in passing. The room's atmosphere became electric, charged with tension and disbelief. Laura's colleagues, who had always respected her professionalism, now sat frozen, eyes darting between her and the evidence on the screen. Tears began to stream down her face, but the bravado that had allowed her to maintain such careful secrecy was gone. She tried to speak, but the words stumbled over one another. I can explain, she whispered, barely audible. But no one leaned in. No one waited for an excuse. The exposure was complete, raw, undeniable. I continued, presenting every detail, the emails, the secret dinners, the small lies that had piled up over months. Every friend, family member, and co-worker absorbed the reality of her betrayal. The laughter that had once filled the room was replaced by an uncomfortable silence, punctuated by the occasional gasp or whisper question. The internal turmoil I had felt for months now manifested externally. I wasn't just hurt, I was enraged. But more than anger, there was clarity. I could finally see the extent of the deception, and I understood that this exposure wasn't just a punishment for Laura. It was liberation for me. Liberation from lies, betrayal, and the weight of pretending that everything was fine. Laura's reaction shifted from shock to desperation. She reached across the table, attempted to take my hand, her fingers trembling. "Please, Daniel, don't do this. I can explain. I love you." Her words, once so comforting, now sounded hollow and manipulative, a last-ditch effort to salvage what she destroyed. I pulled my hand away. Love isn't lies, Laura. Love isn't cheating behind someone's back while pretending everything is fine. You chose this. I didn't. The room had grown tense, the air thick with anticipation and discomfort. Friends who had once smiled warmly at her now looked at her with confusion, pity, and quiet judgment. Family members whispered among themselves, disbelief etched across their faces. Laura, the woman who had seemed untouchable in her confidence and charm, was now reduced to frantic gestures and broken words. Mark, whom no one expected to appear, was eventually traced through social media messages and tagged by friends who had caught fragments of evidence online. When confronted, he denied nothing. The confrontation was raw and public. The man who had shared stolen nights and secret messages with my wife had to face the reality of his role in destroying a family. His presence and story only amplified the shame and exposure for Laura. By the end of the evening, the damage was complete. The intimate web of deception she had spun was now visible to everyone who mattered. There were no excuses, no partial truths, just evidence and the harsh consequences of choices made behind closed doors. As I left the restaurant that night, the cool night air hit my face, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt. My chest was tight, my heart still heavy with grief, but a strange sense of peace settled over me. The betrayal had been painful, devastating even, but it was no longer secret. The truth had a power that deception could never overcome. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Exposing her wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and the possibility of a future where trust and honesty mattered more than appearances. The days after the dinner party felt like living inside a storm. The kind of storm that doesn't announce itself with thunder or lightning, but instead creeps in slowly, drenching every part of your life in chaos. News of Laura's betrayal spread quickly, not like gossip, but like a heavy truth that demanded recognition. Friends avoided eye contact with her in public. Family gatherings became tense. Co-workers whispered behind her back. And through it all, I walked a strange path of relief and heartbreak, caught between the comfort of truth and the grief of lost trust. Returning home after the exposure, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt heavy with memories of laughter that had been tainted by deceit. The faint smell of vanilla from the candles she used to light now seemed hollow, almost mocking. Every corner reminded me of what had been lost. Not just the marriage, but the shared dreams, the future we had built in our imaginations. Yet beneath the grief, a sense of clarity began to grow. I was no longer in the dark. I could see the reality for what it was. Laura, predictably, tried to salvage the situation. She arrived home that evening, her movements hesitant, almost rehearsed. Her eyes, once confident and mischievous, were now wide with anxiety. She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't let her. I had learned that at this point, words were weapons she had always wielded to manipulate reality. She began, her voice trembling. "No," I interrupted firmly, my voice steadied, I felt. "Don't. I've heard enough explanations for a lifetime. You made your choices, Laura." You lied, you cheated, and you tried to hide it. There is nothing left to say." She stood there, tears streaming, hands trembling, but I remained unmoved. I wanted her to feel the weight of the consequences she had ignored for months. For the first time, I saw the full scope of her vulnerability. Not just betrayal, but the emptiness behind her actions, the person she had become when ambition overshadowed integrity and love. The following week was a series of confrontations, direct and indirect. Friends and family reached out to me, some to offer sympathy, others to share their own shock at the betrayal. Some asked questions about how it happened, others about my plans. I realized that my world had expanded to include the emotional aftermath of not just my own heartbreak, but the ripple effects on everyone who had been connected to us. Laura tried to reach out repeatedly. Calls, texts, even messages left at my door. Each attempt was a reminder of the life we once had and of the pain she had caused. I read some of the messages, carefully and deliberately, noting the patterns. Pleas, apologies, justifications, and veiled attempts to manipulate my emotions. But I refused to engage. Each reply would have meant re-entering a space of trust that no longer existed. I spent nights replaying our past, trying to reconcile the woman I had loved with the one who had betrayed me. Our early years seemed almost surreal now. The laughter on rainy campus days, the quiet mornings in our small apartment, the vacation trips where we had walked hand in hand through sunlit streets. All of it existed in a parallel world, a memory that had been beautiful, but ultimately built on half-truths. The house became a place of reflection. I wandered from room to room, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes flipping through photo albums that felt both precious and painfully ironic. The smell of coffee, the faint aroma of a perfume, the lingering warmth of sunlight through the windows, they all reminded me of love and trust, now intertwined with heartbreak. I realized that healing required more than physical distance. It demanded an emotional disentanglement from a life that no longer existed. Friends who had once been close to both of us were now tentative around Laura. I witnessed her attempt to explain herself, to regain a fragment of dignity. But the reactions were telling. People who had once laughed at her jokes now regarded her with a mixture of disappointment, pity, and judgment. The very social fabric she had relied on began to unravel piece by piece, and I felt a quiet sense of vindication, not from cruelty, but from truth. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through exposure. Meanwhile, my own internal struggle persisted. Anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to spill over in moments of frustration. Grief weighed heavily on my chest, reminding me of what I had lost. But slowly, clarity emerged. I realized that my life could not be defined solely by betrayal. I could reclaim control, rebuild, and redefine happiness on my own terms. The process was slow, deliberate, and painful, but every day brought small victories. I began to focus on myself. Mornings became dedicated to reflection, journaling, and silent walks where the city sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of neighbors, the rhythmic footsteps of passers-by, grounded me. I reminded myself that trust, once broken, can't be restored artificially. It has to be rebuilt carefully, and sometimes in entirely new forms. I began reconnecting with friends who had remained supportive, deepening relationships that were honest, unfiltered, and real. Through all of this, Laura's attempts to reclaim control only highlighted the gravity of her choices. She would appear at events, try and amend appearances, but her efforts were transparent. People who had once admired her professionalism now saw the vulnerability beneath the polished exterior. Every failed attempt at reconciliation reinforced a lesson I had learned. Actions carry consequences, and betrayal leaves marks that cannot be erased by words alone. The internal journey I experienced was just as intense as the external fallout. I confronted my own vulnerabilities, my capacity for forgiveness, my boundaries, my understanding of love and trust. I realized that I had placed someone on a pedestal who was incapable of honoring that trust. The heartbreak, while devastating, also became a mirror reflecting my own growth, resilience, and capacity to move forward with integrity. By the end of the month, the social circles that once bound us together had shifted. Laura's reputation had been irrevocably damaged among friends and colleagues, while I began to sense a restoration of my own dignity. There was still pain, yes, but there was also a strange liberation in the clarity of truth. I understood now that exposure wasn't merely an act of revenge. It was a reclamation of self, a reaffirmation of boundaries, and an acknowledgement that honesty and integrity hold far greater value than appearances or comfort. And in the quiet moments when the city hummed softly outside my window, I allowed myself to imagine a future unburdened by deceit, a life where trust could be rebuilt, perhaps differently, but with authenticity at its core. The weeks following the public exposure felt like living inside a storm, almost dreamlike, the kind of storm that doesn't announce itself with thunder or lightning. Everything I had known but instead creeps in slowly. Laura was no longer drenching every part of her life in chaos and admiration. News of Laura's betrayal wherever she went quickly. Her once bright presence was now shadowed like a heavy truth that demanded recognition. And inescapable friends avoided eye contact with her, and friends stopped inviting her. Family gatherings became tense. Colleagues treated her with quiet judgment. Co-workers whispered behind her back. Family members offered support through it all, maintaining a careful distance. I walked a strange path of relief. The very world she had built her image in, caught between the comfort of truth, leaving her isolated and exposed. Returning home after the exposure, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The weight of lies that had pressed on my chest for months had now felt heavy with anger and heartbreak that had been tainted by deceit, but they were tempered by clarity, the faint smell of by the knowledge that truth had been revealed and now seemed hollow in its own way. Mocking. Every corner reminded me of I began rebuilding my life on terms not just of marriage, years, but the shared dreams, carefully, deliberately, future we had built in our new understanding of self-worth. Yet beneath the one evening, a sense of clarity began to grow. I was no familiar, dark, yet altered by the passage of time and for what it was. The smell of rain on asphalt mingled with the scent. Tried to salvage the situation from nearby. She arrived home that evening. I passed cafes, shops, and apartment buildings almost where I spent ordinary, her happy moments with Laura and mischievous. Now tinted now wide with anxiety. Each step opened her mouth to speak. But I didn't remain the same. I had learned that at this point. And that shift felt both terrifying she had always wielded. Laura attempted to contact me again. This time began messages that combined apologies, pleas, and desperate explanations. Firmly. But I no longer felt the compulsion to respond. I've heard every word she wrote reminded me of the woman she had chosen. You made your choices. The woman who betrayed trust, lied, manipulated love, you tried to hide it, placed ambitions over nothing left to say. Silence became my shield, my way of protecting the fragile pieces of my heart, but I remained unsought peace. I wanted her to feel the weight of the friends who had supported me became pillars in my journey toward healing. For the first time, conversations over I saw the full scope of her vulnerability. And honest reflection not just helped me process the depth of the emptiness behind her actions. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about when ambition overshadowed. It wasn't about inviting her back into my life. The following week was about releasing the hold that anger and grief had over me. Friends and family reached out. I began to understand that closure comes not from revenge alone, others to share their own reclaiming your own narrative. And some asked questions about how it happened. Laura, others about my plan, face or consequences. I realized that my world had expanded to include the emotional aftermath crumbled under not just my own heart. Colleagues who had once respected her now everyone who had been connected to us. And social connections. Laura tried to reach out repeatedly. Mark faded from her life as well. Texts, unwilling messages, or unable to bear the weight of exposure. Each attempt was a reminder of the life we once had. She confronted the reality that actions, I read some deceptive ones, carefully carry consequences that cannot be avoided patterns or reversed. Please, I remember one particular night sitting on the balcony of our house, manipulate my emotions, city lights shimmering in the distance. To engage. The faint scent reply would have meant re-entering a space of trust that no longer. The memories of years past. I spent nights replaying our past, shared dreams, and tried to reconcile the moments I had hovered like one who betrayed me. But unlike before, our early years, these memories no longer carried bitterness. The laughter on rainy campus reminders of growth, the quiet mornings in our small apartment, the strength it takes to rise from heartbreak. We had walked hand in hand. I thought about the sunlit streets, about the possibility of existed in a parallel world. Trust had been memory that had been beautiful, but resilience had built on half in its place. The house I realized that life is often cruel. I wander from room to room. That people make choices, sometimes sitting in silence, but that sometimes define the entirety of existence. That felt both precious. There's always a chance ironic. Define the smell of coffee and to surround yourself with honesty and respect. The lingering warmth of sunlight. I found myself laughing again. They all reminded me of love and trust. Without the shadow of deceit now intertwined with heartbreak. The freedom I realized that healing, the liberation from manipulation, and the reclamation of my life allowed emotional disentanglement, to love life again, that no longer cautiously but courageously. Friends who had once been my close friends to both of us noticed a change tentative around Laura. The quiet strength, I witnessed her attempt to explain herself, dignity that came from having to regain a fragment of dignity. I never reconciled reactions with Laura, were telling, and I never people needed who had once laughed at her closure wasn't her apology or her regret. With a mixture of disappointment, it was in the knowledge that I had taken control, exposed the very social fabric she relied on to be broken by someone else's choices, piece by piece. The experience had reshaped me, a quiet sense of vindication, taught me the fragility of trust, not from cruelty, and reinforced the value of integrity. Justice had been served, in the end, not through vengeance, exposing her, but everyone wasn't just an act of revenge. Meanwhile, my own internal liberation existed. It reclaimed not only my dignity, but my understanding of love, threatening to spill honesty and self-respect. Grief as I stepped heavily into my life that was entirely mine reminded me of what I had lost. I felt a profound sense of clarity. Slowly, clarity and betrayal can shatter a world. I realized that my life could not be defined solely by betrayal. Wiser, I could reclaim control, rebuild, and redefine happiness on my own terms. The process was slow, deliberate, and painful, but every day brought small victories. I began to focus on myself. Mornings became dedicated to reflection, journaling, and silent walks where the city sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of neighbors, the rhythmic footsteps of passers-by, grounded me. I reminded myself that trust, once broken, can't be restored artificially. It has to be rebuilt carefully, and sometimes in entirely new forms. I began reconnecting with friends who had remained supportive, deepening relationships that were honest, unfiltered, and real. Through all of this, Laura's attempts to reclaim control only highlighted the gravity of her choices. She would appear at events, try to mend appearances, but her efforts were transparent. People who had once admired her professionalism now saw the vulnerability beneath the polished exterior. Every failed attempt at reconciliation reinforced a lesson I had learned. Actions carry consequences, and betrayal leaves marks that cannot be erased by words alone. The internal journey I experienced was just as intense as the external fallout. I confronted my own vulnerabilities, my capacity for forgiveness, my boundaries, my understanding of love and trust. I realized that I had placed someone on a pedestal who was incapable of honoring that trust. The heartbreak, while devastating, also became a mirror reflecting my own growth, resilience, and capacity to move forward with integrity. By the end of the month, the social circles that once bound us together had shifted. Laura's reputation had been irrevocably damaged among friends and colleagues, while I began to sense a restoration of my own dignity. There was still pain, yes, but there was also a strange liberation in the clarity of truth. I understood now that exposure wasn't merely an act of revenge. It was a reclamation of self, a reaffirmation of boundaries, and an acknowledgement that honesty and integrity hold far greater value than appearances or comfort. And in the quiet moments when the city hummed softly outside my window, I allowed myself to imagine a future unburdened by deceit, a life where trust could be rebuilt, perhaps differently, but with authenticity at its core. The weeks following the public exposure were surreal, almost dreamlike in the way life continued around me while everything I had known unraveled. Laura was no longer the woman who had commanded attention and admiration wherever she went. Her once bright presence was now shadowed by guilt whispers and the inescapable evidence of her choices. Friends stopped inviting her to gatherings. Colleagues treated her with quiet judgment, and family members offered support to me while maintaining a careful distance from her. The very world she had built her image in had shifted, leaving her isolated and exposed. I, on the other hand, experienced a paradoxical freedom. The weight of lies that had pressed on my chest for months had lifted. The anger and heartbreak remained, but they were tempered by clarity, by the knowledge that truth had been revealed and justice had, in its own way, been served. I began rebuilding my life on terms I had neglected for years, carefully, deliberately, and with a new understanding of self-worth. One evening, I walked through our old neighborhood, the streets familiar yet altered by the passage of time and recent events. The smell of rain on asphalt mingled with the scent of blooming jasmine from nearby gardens. I passed cafes, shops, and apartment buildings where I had spent ordinary, happy moments with Laura, now tinted with the knowledge of betrayal. Each step was heavy, yet cathartic. The city had remained the same, but I had changed, and that shift felt both terrifying and liberating. Laura attempted to contact me again, this time through messages that combined apologies, pleas, and desperate explanations. But I no longer felt the compulsion to respond. Every word she wrote reminded me of the woman she had chosen to become, the woman who betrayed trust, manipulated love, and placed ambition over integrity. Silence became my shield, my way of protecting the fragile pieces of my heart that still sought peace. Over time, friends who had supported me became pillars in my journey toward healing. Conversations over coffee, long walks, and honest reflections helped me process the depth of the betrayal. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving her. It wasn't about inviting her back into my life. It was about releasing the hold that anger and grief had over me. Slowly, I began to understand that closure comes not from revenge alone, but from reclaiming your own narrative and living authentically. Laura, meanwhile, faced her consequences fully. The professional reputation she had carefully constructed crumbled under scrutiny. Colleagues who had once respected her now distanced themselves, and social connections eroded rapidly. Mark faded from her life as well, unwilling or unable to bear the weight of exposure. Alone in her choices, she confronted the reality that actions, especially deceptive ones, carry consequences that cannot be avoided or reversed. I remember one particular night, sitting on the balcony of our house, the city lights shimmering in the distance, the faint scent of evening flowers drifting on the breeze. The memories of years past, our laughter, shared dreams, and stolen quiet moments hovered like ghosts. But unlike before, these memories no longer carried bitterness. They were reminders of growth, of lessons learned, and of the strength it takes to rise from heartbreak. I thought about the future, about the possibility of new beginnings. Trust had been broken, yes, but resilience had been forged in its place. I realized that life is often cruel, that people make choices that hurt others profoundly, but that doesn't define the entirety of existence. There is always a chance to rebuild, to find peace, and to surround yourself with honesty and respect. Months later, I found myself laughing again, genuinely, without the shadow of deceit looming overhead. The freedom of truth, the liberation from manipulation, and the reclamation of my life allowed me to breathe, to love life again, and to trust cautiously but courageously. My friends noticed a change in me. The quiet strength, the calm resolve, and the dignity that came from having faced betrayal head-on. I never reconciled with Laura, and I never needed to. The closure wasn't in her apology or her regrets. It was in the knowledge that I had taken control, exposed the truth, and refused to be broken by someone else's choices. The experience had reshaped me, taught me the fragility of trust, and reinforced the value of integrity. In the end, exposing her everyone wasn't just an act of revenge. It was an act of liberation. It reclaimed not only my dignity, but my understanding of love, honesty, and self-respect. And as I stepped forward into a life that was entirely mine again, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Betrayal can shatter a world, but truth and courage can rebuild it, stronger, wiser, and unbreakable.